Hi, I'm Mark Brumley, president of Ignatius Press, and I'm here with Father Joseph Fessio, the editor and founder of Ignatius Press, Vivian Dudra, one of our senior editors, and Mariana Pedrelli, who is the millennial marketeer for Ignatius Press. And we're here to talk about Amoris Laetitia.
Is that like a mouseketeer?
No, not a mouseketeer.
Not that young.
We're here to talk about our Holy Father's recent apostolic exhortation, post-synodal apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, which means, Father?
The joy of love.
The joy of love. Yeah, the joy of love. There was a popular book some years ago called The Joy of Sex.
Yes.
This is the joy of love, properly understood. So
But there's sex in it.
there is. That is a topic that is covered here. And I'd like to begin the discussion by going to you, Father. I mean, you're the senior man here. You're a priest of many years and
Yes.
much theological training.
Uncountable years, yes.
And pastoral insights. What are your reactions as you've read through this document?
First, the title itself, Amoris Laetitia. It's interesting. This Pope has titled two major documents with first Gaudium, Evangelii Gaudium, which means the joy of the gospel, and Amoris Laetitia, which means the joy of love. Interesting, the Latin language has two words for joy, and we are impoverished with only one in English. But if you read the full title, he doesn't translate it that way. It says, On Love in the Family, which I think is quite interesting, because this is a very family-oriented document. And especially the middle part, which I'm sure that Vivian will give us more commentary on, is a beautiful pastoral reflection on preparing for marriage, being married, problems in marriage, way to live your marriage. I mean, there's a lot of very, very positive material there. I want to make 5 points about this. The first one is that I did the same thing that I'm sure that all the major media did. I went to the table of contents to find out where the controversial materials were.
Yes.
This is a 256-page document, very long. The real controversy begins on page 221, way towards the end. It has to do with, whether or not people who are validly married and yet divorced and civilly married may receive communion. And the overall statement to make is there's been no change in this document of authentic church teaching, nor, interestingly, has there been, in my view, a change in sound pastoral practice. I mean, what this document has done in its own way has been to reaffirm what has been a traditional teaching of the church and traditional pastoral, careful, discerning practice of priests and bishops. So that's the first point. The second point is that while I believe the media, the secular media is going to focus on what looks like major change, they probably will not focus as much on the beginning of the document, where he reaffirms in quite strong terms the church's teaching on abortion, contraception, same-sex marriage, gender theory, a few other things. So it's, there's a real reaffirmation here of the church's traditional teaching. Thirdly, if you look at the table of contents, which in the European style of doing things is in the back and not in the front.
If you've read the book, then you go to the table of contents.
That's right. Find out what you read. It looks like it's a very well-organized document, and in fact it is. But it's a composite. And so in this document you find large quotations from not only the Synod of 2015, but the preparatory Synod of 2014. So there's many, many quotations interspersed in the document. Then you have quotations of church teaching, and especially a lot of John Paul II on marriage and the family, which is wonderful that he does that. Thirdly, you have a large selection of his own catecheses, his Wednesday catecheses. And then fourthly, you have some original material there from Pope Francis, which is pastoral reflection on these things. And while it's rich because of that, it's also very long, there's overlapping, there's repetition. In some cases, there's things which don't perfectly mesh with each other in consistency.
Tension between them.
So you have to recognize that it's not like someone writing a book with a unitary, we used to say unity, coherence, and emphasis was your three when you're writing things, which you should do. And so this has emphasis in it, but it lacking in unity and coherence, but not because of the Pope, just because of the nature of the document. So those are the three main things. The two things, though, that I want to mention we can discuss further, one I find, well, both I find somewhat troubling. One is there is a tendency to what I call the flight to abstraction. I didn't make that up for this document. It's something I've been thinking about for years, where bishops, especially in an attempt to be pastoral and reconciling, they will try to describe certain activities in a way that's more euphemistic. So instead of saying, you shouldn't steal that car, they'll say, you haven't lived up to the full potential of the ideal of private property, or something like that. So that there's just sort of a abstracting of things which take away the bite. And I'll give some examples of that in our discussion.
That's a good one. That's a good topic to talk about. We'll come back to that.
The second thing is the Pope is the Pope of mercy, right? But I got to say it, Pope Francis, my Jesuit brother, sometimes you are a scold. I mean, you have an almost unmerciful way of describing certain activities that makes one wonder, whom is he describing? Who's the object? Who's done this? And we'll see some examples of that later on. But it almost seems like a straw man argument. So those are things which, again, don't directly affect the doctrinal integrity of the document or the pastoral soundness of the document. But I think people, especially people who've been striving to live the Catholic life and making sacrifices, can sometimes feel unnecessarily uncomfortable by thinking, gosh, is the Pope attacking me for trying to live the Church's teaching? Anyway, so those are my 5 points.
When you try to find yourself there,
well, I can find myself there pretty easily. But it's good Catholics I'm having a problem with.
But there is when someone who is striving to follow the Church's teaching, someone who embraces it imperfectly, we all fall short. When you say, where is that person here? There's a serious temptation to say, well, that's me, the guy that's getting criticized. So I think that's a topic we should come back to.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about what Father said? Because in a lot of ways, I think he's done a good job of encapsulating what I would say. But I want to hear from you two, see if you've got any differing opinions. And we should point out as we go on. Obviously, you're unmarried, or if you're married to the Church, right?
Right.
I'm a married man, 5 children. Vivian Dudreau is married, 4 children. Mariana is married, no children yet. So, and she's a millennial, so she's getting a little bit more youthful perspective here. We've got, pretty much a married panel here. So that's the perspective from which people come. Vivian, what are your thoughts out of the gate here?
I agree with Father Fessio that it's a pastoral document with a lot of advice for married couples, for people preparing for marriage, for people advising married people, and so on. And there are some places there that are quite moving. And that's more what I was expecting from this pastoral Pope. What actually took me by surprise was how strongly he reaffirms the definition of Christian marriage and calls for its defense and protection in society. He comes out very strongly against the weakening of the family because only it can support society. He defines very clearly that marriage is a exclusive, faithful, lifelong union open to new life.
Between a man and a woman.
Between a man and a woman. He says very strongly, de facto or same-sex unions may not simply be equated with marriage. No union that is temporary or closed to the transmission of life can ensure the future of society. That's just one example. He says over and over again that same-sex unions are not equal to marriage, and he criticizes governments for legally trying to change this and even trying to impose this through foreign aid and so on. So to tell you the truth, I was surprised that there were going to be these very strong and forceful statements on these controversial topics.
Did you think that it was likely the case he wasn't going to change Catholic teaching, but you're surprised that he was so forceful, maybe even some might say in your face on these particular topics.
Correct. I wasn't expecting a change in doctrine, no, but I was maybe expecting, and maybe others out there were expecting him to be softer on some of these topics. And so he's an interesting combination of, here's the teaching, that's not up for grabs, but here's the mercy that the church is supposed to show. He's always trying to stand in that intersection of truth and mercy. And I admire him for that.
And also, in what you said there, precisely in reaffirming the church's teaching, he quoted the Synod report, he quoted John Paul II, he spoke in his own name. So it gives it more strength that it's not either just him or just John Paul II. This is the church speaking here.
And he quotes Vatican II.
Right.
That's true.
And he quotes Familiaris Consortio, which was John Paul II's post-synodal apostolic exhortation.
Right.
One of the first documents he issued as Pope, which is in many ways kind of a compendium of Catholic teaching on marriage and family life. And he went back to that. And one of the debates is, well, has Francis really sort of changed the church's teaching? Maybe not in a formal way, but informally. There's a sort of a principle in theology that, when you have a major document that sort of covers the terrain of a subject, and a subsequent pope comes along and he quotes that document, he uses that document, that teaching sort of stands. It doesn't just change because the subsequent pope doesn't reiterate every single thing in that document. Sometimes you'll get a pope who'll come and he'll put a little different emphasis, different spin on things, maybe a different practical approach. That's all fine, but that doesn't amount to a gainsaying of the previous teaching. So one way to read this, and I know there'll be people on the other side of these issues who'll read it differently, but one way to read this is in continuity with Familiaris Consortio and the previous teaching. All of that stands.
Although he will take a quote from Familiaris Consortio to justify something which is totally opposed to Familiaris Consortio in this document. We'll get to that later.
Right.
Stay tuned.
So sometimes his use of his sources, one can question whether he's sort of getting at the nuance of the original document. But I want to ask you, Mariana, you've read through this now. What are your reactions? Your reaction to the document or to the things that you've heard others say?
Well, I kind of focused on the part that he said married couples would be most interested in, which is chapters 4 and 5. And honestly, I started reading those chapters after a rare argument with my husband. Never happens in my house.
She was wrong, of course.
Of course. But they start out with an examination of 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 7. It's a very cliche now. Scriptural
wedding,
verse.
Everybody's got 1 Corinthians 13.
But he goes through each verse, and kind of gives a reflection and really, I would say, would be something that you could meditate on as a married couple. And so after having this argument with my husband, here I am reading these things about what love is and what it's asking of us.
And patience.
Yes, and a much more depth to those words, though, than maybe you would.
So you let Guido know where he had fallen short.
Exactly. I was like, so in this document, no. So I really felt like, honestly, reading through it, I thought this would be a great section, just that whole reflection for marriage prep course. If I were in a marriage prep course, I would say, hey, this is what this is going to be asking of you, so that when you get married, this is what it entails. This is what love is, So I just was really moved by that. And in general, I think, as much as there's been controversy surrounding this topic with the Synod and everything like that, for me, at least, it's brought it to the forefront in a way that I think is important that we're discussing it now, because I don't think that these were things that were being talked about by everyday churchgoers. Obviously, maybe pastors, priests, and people who are more involved in this part of the teachings of the church were more aware of it. But for me,
like you and Guido.
Yes, obviously.
People on the cutting edge.
Others, yes.
The cutting edge of sanctity that you guys
exactly.
were
Just even bringing to the forefront the idea that, there are members of our church who are in these situations, and we need to be conscious of them as a church body and what that means for us as a church body. So, I feel like that's been beneficial, at least to me personally.
Good. And which portion of this, in addition to the 1 Corinthians 13 section, would you say Guido has to read?
Oh, actually, I highlighted it.
You did.
That's what our argument was about. Was
Okay.
I said, we never have anything to talk about anymore. We just talk about the day to day. What did you do today? What at work?
Right.
What is this? And he said actually about dialogue. I'm going to read this, Guido, if
Okay.
you're watching.
You better read it.
Yeah, we'll send him a tape.
That we finally let us acknowledge that for a worthwhile dialogue, we have to have something to say. This can only be the fruit of an interior richness nourished by reading, personal reflection, prayer, and openness to the world around us. Otherwise, conversations become boring and trivial. So there's a lot of practical
right.
advice in this document as well about, outside of, what are the two things that make a good marriage? The spiritual side, the grace that you get from the sacrament and the other sacraments, and then the practical realities of communication, dialogue, all of these things. And I think that he touches on both in this document.
So you sort of have to have things to talk about in order to talk about things.
Yes,
right?
that helps.
And you get those things. One of the ways you get them is by having an enriched interior life and thinking about things and praying about things and being reflective.
And reading good books. Ignatius.com. Please go there.
By the way,
This will enrich your life. You have something to talk
we have a
about.
stack of books. I'm going to bring them out later.
And just
Yeah,
on
later
that topic, one of the blessings here at Ignatius Press, we now have lunch together, many of us,
do.
and we're able to talk about the manuscripts we're reading and books and the news and things like that. So if you have enough people together who are alert to what's happening in the world, also reading good books, and perhaps watching good films, it really enriches conversation.
And it's interesting that we're all sort of, theologically we're all on board with the church's teaching, but oftentimes we disagree about a lot of practical things. And sometimes
I believe in your right to be wrong.
Yes, I know you do, and appreciate that fact. But that's interesting too, because that's a dynamic in marriage, in married life, that you will have two people, they love each other. You hope that they share a commitment of faith and at least some common aspects of a worldview, and yet they can disagree about things. And Debbie and I disagree a lot. She straightens me out, but we disagree about things as well as agree about things. But that dimension of love and that commitment to that person as your spouse, that helps you sort of mediate those disagreements. You say what's really important.
I know your children as well as I know Vivian's children because they're here, but as your children go older
Right.
and go different ways and have different competences, that adds to the conversation. Think about talking to Mary about literature or Thomas about world
Right.
politics and military stuff. Or Steve about art. It really enriches the conversation to have children who have developed themselves in different ways.
Well, and even things like in our family, things that you'd think, and I generally talk, when I talk about this to people, I say, television can be a real deadener of family life or conversation. But if you're going to watch something, you're going to watch a movie, helping your kids be intelligent, thoughtful, interactive viewers. Like you want them to be that way as a reader. If they're going to watch a movie, to be able to think about it and talk about it and come away and say, here's what I found, what I liked about it, didn't like, what I learned, what I agreed with, I disagreed with, that kind of thing. I think that's part of the dynamic of marriage that we're talking about here.
What did you think about this document now that you've asked us?
All of the points that you made, I think I agree with, Father.
good.
I probably would, and I agree with Vivian, I certainly did not anticipate that there would be any kind of significant change in church teaching. But I thought there might be a kind of toning it down or soft pedaling certain things, and he didn't do that.
No.
He was very clear on those items that you mentioned. And I could even see a fair headline saying, Pope upholds Catholic teaching. Now,
Yes.
that's not
Look
necessarily
for it.
that's not necessarily what we're going to see. I think we're going to see something different. And that's really kind of where I wanted to go. I wanted to ask you folks, what do you think the headline is going to read? Now, of course, we're recording this in advance of the official release of the document, which will come out very, very shortly when people are watching this. They already know, I guess, and many of them will already know what the headlines are going to be. So we're going to be tested here in our prophetic abilities. What do you think the headline is going to say about
Pope
this?
approves communion for second marriages.
Okay. Why do you think it's going to say that?
Because where on the one hand, he reaffirms the church's teaching and says we must hold to that, he refers to it not as an institution or as a formal teaching, but as an ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And so he describes people who are not living up to the ideal in that way. But that could mean committing adultery. It could mean having 2 wives or 2 husbands. It could mean all sorts of things, not living up to the ideal. And then from that, then he goes on to say that in the pastoral context, when you're dealing with people in difficult situations, you have to take account of their circumstances and the path to full communion with the church. In the meantime, they're part of the church. We must integrate them. And you read all that stuff, and those who want to find it in there are going to say, oh, well, you know,
Right. So
that's me.
So to be clear to the viewers, the document itself doesn't say that.
No.
But you think that there's enough in there that somebody who's looking for an out will interpret it that way.
Well, you know, I'm not that bright, but if I were in a second marriage, I could find it in here,
Yeah.
you know, without abusing the text.
Especially since on the very second page or so, the Pope says that allowances have to be made for special needs and local situations, and the magisterium shouldn't interfere with this.
Yeah, the bishops in a given region
Right.
have their own
Right.
issues and they handle it
Right.
certainly.
Each country, page 4, each country or region, moreover, can seek solutions better suited to its culture and sensitive to its traditions and local needs.
Right,
Read Germany, go ahead.
right.
That's how some people will read it.
That is how some people will read it.
Right.
Now, it's interesting, some of these things we've talked about. One of the words that kept coming up as I read this was maturity. I think the Pope understands that every Christian is, as cliche as it sounds, on a journey. All of us are growing in Christ. It's a gradual process. We need grace, we need help, we need mercy along the way. And he's trying to bring people onward and upward throughout this whole document. And so he's trying to be sensitive to the fact that there are these situations where people are falling short of an ideal, and he's trying to make accommodations for them and make them feel like they are part of the church, to integrate them as much as possible so that they will continue on that path and virtue, which all of us are on. None of us are there yet. None of us have reached the pinnacle of love yet. Mm-hmm. So I'm sympathetic with him trying to do this. But I just also recognize that there's this opportunity that he's making the church vulnerable to being relativized.
Right.
And that's the danger of taking this approach.
I want to come back to that point, and I think it was sort of implicit, maybe even explicit in what you said earlier. I want to come back to that in a moment, but I want to read a passage here from paragraph 300, and it's speaking of the role of pastors in dealing with people in irregular situations, specifically, I think in this context, people who are divorced, civilly remarried. He says, priests have a duty to accompany the divorced and remarried in helping them to understand their situation according to the teaching of the church and the guidelines of the bishop. So when we talk about accompaniment and accompanying people in these situations, he does make it clear that the obligation of the pastor is to help people understand their situation, not as they think of it, but according to the teaching of the church. So that's really a major component here.
Well, related to that is the criteria for discerning these situations,
Right.
which the Pope says the following conditions must be present: humility, discretion, and love for the church and her teaching, in a sincere search for God's will and a desire to make a more perfect response to it. Those are
my
the
question here, and who is not humble and discreet and sincere? In other words, what he says is true. But it's like telling your children that, just because you think you love this person, don't think you really, you can do everything you want. Oh, but we're different. We're sincere. We're genuine. The point is, who is going to consider himself in the category of someone who is not humble, not discreet, doesn't love the church, and is not searching for God's will? I mean, the whole point is that these people all consider they are, but maybe they're not doing it.
Right. But the word teaching is right there too.
And love for the church and her teaching.
Right. Love for the church is teaching.
Well, unfortunately, being a Jesuit, Vivian, I know that love for the church's teaching can mean love for the church as it is becoming and is supposed to be and will be in the future.
Oh.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, so this is sort of presuming that someone is looking at this, they're in good faith, they're honest, they really want to do the right thing.
Right.
And you're saying, well, that's fine, but people who have kind of gotten themselves into some situations may well be able to tell themselves, oh, I'm being humble, I'm open to this and all that, when maybe in fact they're not at some level. So I want to go back to what you were saying when you were talking about the flight into abstraction. And this is not something that is unique to this document, as you pointed out.
Absolutely not. No, it's something which you know, has been very prevalent in the church in the last 30, 40 years, but I think it shows itself in this document. Let me give a concrete example of St. John the Baptist, whom Jesus spoke of as, you know, the greatest one among women, you know. He did not tell Herod that, Herod, you're not living up fully to the ideal of marriage. He said, Herod, it is unlawful to take your brother's wife as your own. I mean, both
Right.
are true statements, but one of them got his head cut off. The other one probably wouldn't have had any effect at all.
Right.
But here's what I mean.
If Herod would have even known what he was talking about.
Examples. So paragraph 5, because it seeks to encourage everyone to be a sign of mercy and closeness wherever family life remains imperfect or lacks peace and joy. Well, you know, we're all going to be imperfect and lack peace and joy, but the question is, are you committing adultery or you're not?
Right.
You know, is that imperfect? Oh, yes, it is. But it's not the same thing as coming home and yelling at your wife or something like that. But this is consistent. I will offer an invitation to mercy and the pastoral discernment of those situations that fall short of what the Lord demands of us. It's true. If I kill my enemy, I'm falling short of the Lord's demands, but that's not the same thing as telling a lie.
Right.
You know? Or going further here, I mean, I don't go too much longer because there's a lot, it comes up again and again. That's what bothers me the most about it. Here's this one. He now refers to the scriptural thing, the woman caught in adultery. Woman caught in adultery, when she meets Jesus, she meets not condemnation, but the admonition to lead a more worthy life. Jesus did not say, lead a more worthy life. He said, go and sin no more. I haven't done a word search for sin in this document, but I mean, it's definitely...
The word is there, but I mean, I think your point is that we have to make a distinction between people who recognize the goal and they're striving to reach it and they occasionally stumble and fall. That's different from someone who says, I don't accept that goal. I'm doing something different, and you need to conform and accept me on my own terms. So those are different ways of looking at it.
Paragraph 34. The ideal of marriage marked by commitment to exclusivity and stability. So that's the ideal. And if you're not fully exclusive or fully stable, oh, well, you just haven't reached the ideal yet. Committing adultery is not falling short of an ideal. Committing adultery is a sin. And so there's this whole tendency of watering down the language, I think, is dangerous. Here's another example, page 28. This will be the, no, it's not 28. Okay, let me go to page 221 here. Now we're in the back, that section where it's going to be interpreted, I believe, by the press as loosening up the church's pastoral practice on these things. But the same thing, illumined by the gaze of Jesus Christ, the church turns with love to those who participate in her life in an incomplete manner. Well, do you all participate in a complete manner? No. What is he describing there? He's describing people who have a valid marriage, civilly divorced, civilly married, and describing it as participating in her life in an incomplete manner. To me, that obscures things. Although she constantly holds up the call to perfection and asks for a fuller response to God, the church must accompany with attention and care of the weakest of her children. I agree with that totally. But the point is, being faithful to your wife, your husband, is not a counsel of perfection.
Right. It's not like this is good, do better.
Yeah.
Right.
This is the meaning of marriage.
Right.
What you said about discernment, this is paragraph 303 and then 304. This discernment is dynamic. It must remain ever open to new stages of growth and the new decisions which can enable the ideal to be more fully realized. Again, this is true.
Right.
But the thing is, if you're committing adultery, then it's not like, well, you're not fully realizing the ideal. You gotta
Right.
realize it more perfectly. No, that's a sin. And then he says this, and here's what you were talking about earlier. It is reductive simply to consider whether or not an individual's actions correspond to a general law or rule.
Right.
Would you like to comment on that, Mr. Brumley?
Well, I mean, one of the concerns I have is this discussion about general rules. We commonly use the word, speak in general or speak of general principles and things of that sort. We can by that mean this is what typically happens. In general, this is what happens. Or we can mean by that, here is a maxim or a norm or a rule that encompasses all particulars. And I think sometimes there's some confusion in this document on that point. He says, we can't just take general rules and apply them to particular cases as if that settles the matter. And there's a sense in which that's true, but that's because particular cases often involve a variety of general principles, and we have to figure out which ones govern in a particular instance.
A hierarchy.
A hierarchy.
Yeah.
The alternative is to suppose, and I don't think this is what he means, but I think this is how some people can take him, that there are particular situations for which there are no moral principles or general norms that come into play. It seems to me, you either acknowledge, yes, there are general norms, and at least one of them or some of them always apply, or you're saying that this is a situation that we have no rules or guidance from God on how to resolve it. So I think that's a weakness in the document.
I'll conclude with two more quotes here, just the same theme though, because in this section he's talking about the controversial issue about giving communion to those who are civilly
Right.
married, okay? Paragraph 306. In every situation, when dealing with those who have difficulties in living God's law to the full.
Which is
Did anybody not have a
just
difficulty in living God's law to the full? So you describe this particular situation in a general category that applies to pretty much everybody, and therefore, what does that mean? You can't distinguish between, let's say, adultery and
Not praying enough.
losing your temper,
Or
not
losing
praying
your
enough.
temper, not praying enough. Something like that. Right.
307. In order to avoid all misunderstanding, I would point out that in no way must the church desist from proposing the full ideal of marriage. And that's a great positive statement. But marriage is an ideal. See, once you get that language, that framework, it's an ideal, and we're all kind of struggling towards it, well, then you can't distinguish between actually opposing, although in one paragraph he does talk about that, actually contradicting the ideal and actually moving toward it. I mean, you're not moving towards the ideal if you're committing adultery. I mean, that's not a step closer to a good marriage. And then finally on page 240 here, he talks about the church's pastors in proposing to the faithful the full ideal of the gospel and the church's teaching. So again, I'm all for ideals. I'm just saying that you can't cover all activity as an approach of more or less proximity to an ideal. That distorts the reality.
I mean, I agree about this word ideal being dangerous in the sense of how people understand it. I mean, it was used actually in my marriage prep when it came to contraception. Like, oh, well, the ideal
This is the ideal.
Yeah, that
Right.
you wouldn't, but practically speaking, it's,
We
that's a different
understand
thing. Yeah,
that you're
life is hard.
striving and you're going to fall short.
Yeah, so I can see how that can be a dangerous word. I mean, I do think, though, sometimes in the way that John the Baptist maybe approached Herod, as opposed to like a pastor having a conversation with a member of his flock. What inspires them to turn away from adultery? Is it just that adultery is a sin, or you want? And I think so much of this document is about inspiring that we can try to achieve this heroic love with grace, and putting these things into action and reflection, and I think that's what his point is that like you want to inspire these people who are, yes, committing sins and failing in their, to love better. And that's where they're going to be, that's where they're going to have a motivation to maybe turn away from those sins.
So you think that one reaction, obviously, if you tell somebody, you're sinning, if this is somebody who's open to the truth and loves the truth, that person may say, you're right, you got me, I need to repent of that. But another reaction may be, who are you to tell me I'm sinning? Or what do you mean I'm sinning? I'm sincere, I'm loving, and so on. So out of the gate, you might not get that person's attention if you try this sort of John the Baptist to Herod approach. And I think that's probably what he's attempting here. Do you think it's important, though, at some point to kind of convey to a person that it's not just a failure to be your optimal best or to reach your personal best, but you're actually acting in a way that's harmful or wrong or contrary to the good?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. And I do think, I think that, yeah, of course, that would be part of the conversation, is you can't, dance around the fact that those are sins and they're harmful to not just yourself, but other people. But I think, the other thing is, like, I feel like most people, even who are not of a religious bent at all, know that adultery is wrong. They know that it's wrong.
It's cheating.
It's frowned upon,
Right.
Maybe less and less, unfortunately. But so the kind of thing is, if you know that it's wrong already and you're still doing it anyway, where can I grab you back to the right? How can I grab you back to the right path?
So he's pointing them to the ideal, in the sense of saying, look at this that's so good and wonderful.
Yeah.
Don't you really want that?
Yes.
So why don't you want to live consistent with that vision rather than something else? Mm-hmm. Maybe he might say something less, but we really know that means something else, something different.
Yes.
All right. Vivian, what do you think about that? You think that's at work here?
Yes, but we have to, in order not to have this be a flight up to abstraction, we have to discuss what case is he talking about here. He's talking about the case where a person had been married in the church, now is divorced, now civilly remarried, and he gives the description of this relationship that they now have been stably married. They might now even have children of their own they're raising. Going back to that previous relationship is now impossible without sinning against now this person and these children. He's talking about a pretty concrete case, and he's asking the question, or the bishops who pose this question are asking the question, how do we pastorally care for people in this situation? And so it is a tricky situation, because we all know that people presenting themselves to communion, heaven only knows what they're doing. We don't know what they're doing. Right. I don't want to know what they're doing. But
I don't know what I'm doing.
Exactly. But in the case of marriage, because it's a public act,
right, it has implications for the community.
It does. And so now you could see how this person in this situation, now I've returned to the church, now I want to live a sacramental life, and you're saying I can't because I'm in this objectively disordered situation, and that's not fair. You can hear that claim. Right. That's not fair. You're telling me now I have to either not have sex with my wife or refrain from communion. What you're asking of me is too hard. You can see how this particular concrete situation has kind of pushed the church to the edge of clarifying its doctrine, and what are you going to do about it? Right. And I don't think it's an easy situation.
Well, it's certainly not easy in the sense of saying, here are the 5 things you do, and write back and tell me how it all works out.
Right. Know? So you look like you wanted to say something.
Well, in many ways, it's not easy. and definitely not easy to live out. But in many other ways, it is easy. I mean, if you really believe yourself that your first marriage was valid and not invalid, and now you find yourself in a civil marriage, but now you've come back to the church, you're living a sacramental life, you realize that you're not married to this woman. You've got children by her now, but that if you're going to follow what Christ is asking of you, it may take heroism, but you've got to strive to live as brother and sister. That's been the consistent teaching of the church, and the church has always understood, well, look, you have to try. You may not succeed. You may fall, go back to confession, but if in fact you're still married to this woman, you can't be sexually intimate with this other woman. That's,
Right.
You know?
Right.
And so, is it hard? Well, it's hard, but guess what? You know, priests are asked to do that. Do you think we don't love women too? What about the Pope? I mean, he has to abstain from sex. I mean, it's not like sex is the be-all and the end-all, and without sexual intimacy,
That's right.
we can't become fully persons.
Right.
That is a cultural fog that's false around us, that you really want to be happy, you got to have good sex. Sorry.
Marianne, you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, in the situation that Vivian was talking about, the situation that Pope Francis is, basically putting forth, where they were in a valid marriage, they weren't, practicing, came back to the church, or in a civil marriage, now want to participate in the sacraments. And then what Father was saying, what the church teaches about that, and I agree, but I think that's you said it might take heroic love, and again, I think that's what he is, trying to inspire in people. So this couple comes into, to talk to their pastor about their situation, and instead of saying, well, you're not allowed to receive communion, you're living in a state of sin right now, these people who are striving and to reach the ideal but are falling short, like most of us, instead of saying, well, let's talk about how you love this person that you are in this relationship with. What's really loving them, Is it loving them to continue leading them in this life that brings them away from the church, and kind of really just motivating them to try for something that they think is out of their reach and so hard right now, which is
And
abstain.
this is a point he does come back to, that we shouldn't think of this as out of anybody's reach, that there is grace.
Yes.
That grace makes this possible.
Exactly.
This is something we can attain.
And I think that this whole synod, again, I mean, I think it's brought it into the light, where maybe people now will go and approach. I mean, I know there's been cases of, couples saying, well, I want to be able to receive communion now. That's what Pope Francis said or whatnot.
Right.
But at the same time, having the church look at them and look at their situation and be aware of it, and feeling encouraged to maybe go and discuss that and talk about it among the faithful in the church as well. Before, I don't really think that, at least again, I said I don't want to do this we thing that maybe is going on in here, but for me, it's just not something that I was really conscious of, and now it's brought
Right. I'm sure there are a lot of people that didn't realize there was much of a problem, but now that
Exactly.
there's been a discussion
Exactly.
about it, they're saying, oh, wait a minute, I didn't realize that this is an issue.
yeah, and how we can encourage
Because a lot of people after divorce simply leave the church.
Right.
And,
And a lot of people think that if they're divorced, they're excommunicated.
right. And he makes it clear over and over again that the divorced person is not excommunicated. So how do we integrate into the church? That's a word he uses a lot. Accompanying is another word he uses a lot. And these are important questions that when this happens to people, for them not to feel like they have to leave. There's no place for them. So you're right, Mariana, that maybe the fact that this has been discussed publicly, for all of the perils of discussing it publicly, the good thing might be that divorced persons might realize they are welcome in the church and they can seek out pastoral guidance and be reintegrated.
I want to make a clear distinction, though. It's not divorce which is the problem. Although divorce is an evil, he calls it that. It's divorce and civil remarriage.
Correct.
Because some people think, oh, I'm a Catholic, you can't get divorced. Well, of course you can. I mean, not a good thing, but it's the attempted remarriage which
Right.
is the problem.
Correct, Father. But I know people who, after the divorce, left the church.
That's what I'm saying.
Just because they were mistaken,
Exactly
thinking
right.
that they were. So this does
Exactly
need
right.
to be
Wow.
clarified.
Yeah.
This does need to be clarified
Yeah.
for people.
Can I bring up one more point here? My
Sure.
other point about my fifth point is mainly on on page 27 here. Just want to give a couple of examples of this. Get it here. Okay. And he uses the we here, but it's not the papal we. It's sort of the you guys we, you know.
You and me, but especially you.
Yeah. We often present marriage in such a way that its unit of meaning, its call to grow in love, and its ideal of mutual assistance are overshadowed by an almost exclusive insistence on the duty of procreation. Now, I don't know. Have you heard about that? I mean, has someone told you that before?
I have never heard that in the church since I've been a Catholic, ever.
Yeah, I think that there probably are people who do that, but they're a tiny, tiny, tiny minority.
Yeah.
And it's possible that they did it more back when Pope Francis was a young man.
Right.
I mean, he's in his, 70s, so it's possible that when he was a younger man,
he encountered that.
He encountered that. But modern American Catholics,
Right.
have we ever heard from the
I
pulpit?
will say this: there are Catholics who dissent from the church's teaching. They reject it. They say it's false. It's not just that it's a standard that they're striving to live up to, and they fall short in sin. They say no, that's not. That shouldn't even be presented as a standard. That's wrong. There are Catholics who approach things from that perspective, who would say what is said there, if that's what the church teaches, then by definition, it's rigid, it's intolerant,
Right.
it's insensitive, it's burdensome, and all of that. Of course, the people who say that have to level that accusation against Francis too, because he affirms those teachings. And they reject them, he affirms them. So there is a group of people who view the church's teaching in that way, but those are people who reject it. I don't know, by and large, I don't know many Catholics today who talk that way, who present the church's teaching in that way. It's not like over the last 30 or 40 years, every time you go to Sunday Mass, the subject comes up, and this is how the pastor is approaching the topic. In fact, I would say it's the vast majority of Catholics don't even know the teaching. It's not that it's presented in a negative way. It's not presented at all.
But if it's skewed, it's not skewed towards exhortations to procreation as
Right.
opposed to love and unity.
That's right. That's
you
right.
know? Or we have long thought, that simply by stressing doctrinal, bioethical, and moral issues without encouraging openness to grace, we were providing sufficient support to families. Huh?
Right. So you're saying who's we?
Yeah.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
we, Tonto. This is... We find it difficult to present marriage more as a dynamic path to personal development and fulfillment than as a lifelong burden. When we have marriage, perhaps say it's a lifelong burden. Be careful, There's no development here, There's no grace here.
I think that's, we could have all kinds of interesting conversations about some of these points in pastoral language and all of that. And even people here might disagree about how effective or ineffective that language is. But on this point, I just think this is just wrong. It's just patently wrong. That I think it's a sort of kind of out of touch with the real situation of the church, at least in the United States and Europe. I don't know what goes on in Latin America, Argentina. If I'm reading Cardinal Sarah's book, which we have here, by the way, accurately, I don't think this goes on in Africa. So I have to say, I'm not sure where that is. Maybe it's in the past.
And to me, it's a blemish on this because there's so much good in this document. And as Mariana, you said, there's things to read here and reflect on and discuss for young married people. There's a strong affirmation with mercy of the church's teaching. But at least for me, it distracts. It sets me on edge. But wait a minute, he's making these statements which are kind of outrageous. So I'm afraid it may discredit the good things he's saying among people who are, reasonable people saying, hey, what's he doing here,
I have a question about the we, because I definitely...
We have a question about we?
We
What
do. I think there's some issues with it, especially in the way that you quoted it there. I do wonder, though, if you use some, if that automatically would be for a cue for everybody to say, well, I'm not some. You know what I mean? So whereas we... everybody kind of has to reflect and go,
Does this
is
apply to me?
this me? You know what I mean? So maybe the people who are doing those things are going to have to be called to kind of reflect. And maybe they'll still, no, it's not me,
Right.
but it's kind of a use of language to get that self-reflection.
That could be. I also think it's possible that he intends the reader of those words to be an outsider, and he is trying to say to that outsider, we, meaning I, understand that you perceive the church to have done this, to have been this, and so on. And I'm saying these things so that you realize, I realize that's how you perceive it.
Well, they better change the address of the letter to bishops, priests and deacons, consecrated persons, Christian married couples, and all the lay faithful. That's whom he's addressing it to.
Well, isn't it sort of the in the same genre as papal apologies for the
yeah.
Crusades and Galileo and so on? I mean, isn't maybe to put the best possible spin on it, isn't it this acknowledgement that in the past, maybe long past by now, but nevertheless, in the past, there have been churchmen who talked about marriage in this way.
Right.
And we acknowledge that and accept the guilt for that corporately. And now that we've gotten that out of the way, we can move on.
Yeah, I think there's probably some of that. What I'd say in response to that is, it would be helpful if it were clarified that I'm talking about something that's happened, in the past, and
But-
that it isn't the current situation that most Catholics encounter.
But what
this.
keeps it alive is that a lot of media caricatures
Right.
of priests and clerics and nuns and so on is still this caricature. The nun with the ruler,
Right.
rapping kids on the
Absolutely.
knuckles, the priest who's all tied up in knots about sex and
Right.
thinks the body is something dirty. I mean, this caricature is kept alive in the collective consciousness, if you will, because
society,
of a
sure.
lot of what we have in entertainment media. And so,
So
maybe
he may be trying to talk past that, get around it.
and just say, mea culpa, now let's move on.
Right.
I mean,
but I think there are Catholics who are going to say, wait a minute, where do I see this in my church? This hasn't been going on. I don't know where. It's like when you watch, a depiction of a Catholic in a movie. You say, well, where does this stuff happen? It doesn't
for
happen in my parish.
But the one thing to remember is that the people who've left the church over
Right.
these issues,
That's how they see it.
that's the church in their memory. And to bring them back, they want to see an acknowledgement of their experience and their pain and so on. So maybe he's trying to do that.
Yeah,
So
or
maybe
even
oh, go ahead.
no, I do think that it is the minority. I mean, for me, again, to reiterate, I've never heard anything about procreation from the pulpit ever. But it might be the experience of some few individuals who have taken issue with it or have spoken to it, and I mean, I don't know what when they did the data collection for the synod, what their response was to that, but to acknowledge that and to say, look, you feel like that this is what the church has, portrayed to you as our understanding of marriage is this, and I'm here to tell you that's not, let me correct that by having this. And so speaking to those people who may even in the present have experienced.
I think we should
Those
send
things.
Mariana to Rome, and you can help with the next papal document.
Oh,
Because I think you made the point. I mean, that may be what the intent is, but the way you phrased it kind of gets around our objection. And if that had been phrased that way, then I think those of us who are expressing concern about this here would have said, yeah, of course, I'm on board for that. Yeah.
And I don't even mind acknowledging that I find myself to some extent there. It's my Catholic friends who are really seriously trying to live the faith who will feel that they're being attacked, who I think are being attacked unjustly. I mean, priests who are trying to uphold the church's teaching in a hostile culture. And they read this and say, oh my gosh, the Pope is now undermining me.
Right.
I feel
So
bad for
so
them.
when I raise this topic, then immediately I'm pigeonholed as the guy that the Pope is talking about.
But do you feel like if they read the whole document, they would really feel that way? I mean, if they read it all, and given what he says about all the same things that they're trying to promote, and maybe in the same way that they tried to promote them, do you really think that they would feel like he was criticizing them and telling them they're doing something wrong? I mean, I understand that reaction, but I think that takes time to that takes reflection and prayer to really say, you know what, it's okay that he's not talking to me.
Right. Right.
I don't have to be part of that.
I don't have to be that person.
And I mean,
Right.
I understand that, and I do think a lot of people have, in those situations, a lot of priests, a lot of lay people have maybe felt unsupported by that. But I think part of the reason is because they don't realize that he might not be talking to them.
Right. Well, as I read through it, my reaction to that was this doesn't apply to me. I don't know whether it's intended to apply to me, and I don't know whether, if the Holy Father or someone else were to sit down with me and hear my perspectives on things, he would say, "That's you." I hope not, but it may be that this is how some of us are perceived.
And it will be how the media paints us. That is to say, if we now quote Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply,
Right.
we'll be told, oh, but look at paragraph,
this is you.
you're focused on procreation.
Right.
Then you'll have to pull out another paragraph.
You have to find the other, the counterbalance paragraph. That's very good.
Call Mariana.
Call Mariana.
Info@ignatius.com.
She's very
Please don't
good.
email me.
Because he talks very beautifully about the role of procreation in marriage,
He
about
does.
the beauty of love not being turned in on itself, but open
And
to
large families. It's a beautiful thing about large
he
families.
thanks the
It's a joy for the church.
It's a joy for the church. He talks about the necessity of brothers and sisters to learn how to love. So he does all those things. He affirms all these things in a very beautiful and pastoral way. So you do have to maybe keep reading. I would just you want to encourage people if
Mariana
you
says you read
yeah
the good parts.
keep reading. Yeah.
You read it in context. Get the big picture. I wanted to raise a question with respect to this focus, because we're kind of focusing on the controversial topics, what we think the headlines are going to be. By the way, you didn't tell me your headlines. What do you think the headline is going to be for this?
I think it's going to be along the lines that Father Fessio suggested.
Okay.
That
Church
relaxes.
loopholes found.
Loopholes found. Mariana.
Oh, well, I didn't read the whole document, so I can't really give that grade. If it were my choice, I would say Pope Francis inspires the faithful to heroic love.
They were asking not what would you like to see.
What it should be. From the chapters that I read, if they'd only read those chapters, then they'll be good.
And that's what they'll get. That's what we'll get out of it. All right. We have, as I suspected we would, especially Father and me, we've kind of focused somewhat on the critical things we find. What could we say? We could say that they're not optimal. They're less than optimal articulations of what we'd like to see here in the document. Although you began with, I think, a pretty good summary of
Positive.
a lot of positive things. And it's easy, I guess, for us to kind of descend into the negative pretty quickly. And I find that even in documents I'm really enthusiastic about. I look for the punctuational errors and wrong footnote references and so on. But I think it'd be good to go back and situate this conversation in the more positive context overall. And I think, Vivian, you have a passage that you think is important for people to keep in mind as they're reading this document, reflecting on its contents. Would you share that with us?
Yes, it's related to what Mariana has been saying all along about the call to love and inspiring people to go higher. The Pope says, today, most important than the pastoral care of failures is the pastoral effort to strengthen marriages and thus to prevent their breakdown.
Right.
So how do we do that as a church? How do we strengthen marriage, and how do we help prepare people for marriage, and how do we continue to inspire people to love more deeply?
And I think part of the answer is what you see Pope Francis doing here, and I agree with you, presenting that ideal and putting it out there as something to strive after. It's going to be difficult for people to do that if they're not aware of the ideal. And so articulating that, I think, is important. I'm going to say one thing that's a little bit negative. I was sort of negative going into the Extraordinary Synod, and I wrote a piece for Crux, which I said, they're going to say a lot of things at these meetings, but what I want to hear is I want an apology. I want an apology from pastoral leaders in the church that over the last 30, 40 years, so many of our pastors haven't presented the church's teaching in an energetic, positive way. And in fact, some of this wonderful work that St. John Paul II did, theology of the body, talking about the nature of marriage, giving us such a wealth of resource. I remember back in the 80s and in the 90s when I worked for a diocese how much opposition there was to this teaching. It is basic affirmation of John Paul II's teaching. People in official, I'm not picking on the Diocese of San Diego in particular, but in official places in the church actually opposed this teaching. I want somebody to apologize for that. And they can use the collective we if they like. I want an apology to say that some of the problems we're seeing in the church today with respect to divorce and remarriage and cohabitation and confusion about sexuality, that there's responsibility here on the part of our pastors who weren't always leading us and helping us, not with the negative, condemnatory stuff, but with that positive vision, the affirmation, energetic, enthusiastic, winsomely presenting the full gospel of the family. That's what I want to see. I didn't see that in this document. I didn't see it at the synod. That's okay. I'm probably never going to see that. But if we move in a more positive direction, like you're talking about, that probably will be enough. You wanted to say something, Father?
My concluding remark, after which you can conclude the conclusion, is that I say to all of us and to Pope Francis to take seriously Paragraph 139. Keep an open mind. Don't get bogged down in your own limited ideas and opinions, but be prepared to change and expand them.
All right. Well, that sounds like good advice coming from a Jesuit. Well, I want to thank you all for this fun and sometimes very spirited discussion. I hope we've generated more light than heat out there with our viewers. And I want to thank you, the people who are watching this. Please get our books, buy our books. We have a lot of books that deal with this topic. This is a little commercial moment. Pope Francis has written a beautiful. What did I do with it? I don't have it here handy.
On the family?
Oh, it's on the family.
This
Right
one.
there.
Oh, there it is. Pope Francis has written this. This is actually a collection of his catechesis. Father mentioned it earlier in the discussion on the family. It's a beautiful, inspiring. In fact, one of our staffers read this and said it brought her to tears. It's an inspiring presentation of the Catholic vision of marriage and family life on the family. So I encourage you to get that. Also want to mention Remaining in the Truth of Christ, which is a compilation of essays on marriage and communion in the Catholic Church and the tradition regarding marriage and communion in the Catholic Church. I think you won't want to be without this. And of course, I've got a lot of other things here, the Gospel of the Family, the Hope of the Family, and probably the most widely discussed document never to have been read in the history of the Catholic Church, Humanae Vitae, on Human Life by Pope Paul VI.
Which is the very first book published by Ignatius Press in 1978.
And Pope Francis quotes it
Pope Francis
and reiterates it
and
in
reiterates
this
it.
document.
So we shouldn't come away, even though we've kind of had some of these criticisms, with the thought that somehow Pope Francis is trying to take this back. He's not. He's trying to make it pertinent to our lives today. So please get these books and get other resources. Learn more about the Catholic vision of marriage and family. Thanks very much.
Thank you.